Hello, I'm Brian Nickel, and today I will be covering the basic concepts of Dr. Walt Brown's Hydroplate Theory. I say basics, which may imply we can cover this quickly. Unfortunately, I found that brevity only leads to misunderstanding, so I'll explain in depth as much as possible to ensure the basics are not simply covered, but that the foundational supporting evidence and science is understood. To understand the theory, we will need to cover multiple areas of study, some of which are well known by the general public, and others that may not be. First, let's cover the flood passage recorded in the Bible. It is an account which many find hard to believe, and for good reason. Most have not studied the passage closely, and fewer still have established a working explanation which correlates what we see today with what Genesis says occurred. The flood seems impossible under the light of casual observation, which leads most to conclude it was not global or is pure myth. We'll briefly discuss the text and context of the flood in Genesis, and we'll then look at Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which I've found to be by far the most scientifically in-depth explanation of what truly was a cataclysm, or in the Greek, katakludzo, which is the very word Peter uses in 2 Peter to describe the Genesis flood as a cosmos or worldwide event. The account of the flood in Genesis chapter 6 to 9 brings up some difficult questions. Many struggle to answer these questions without deferring to miracles or concluding that the passage is not to be taken literally. These unsatisfactory answers lead to a certain ambivalence about the importance of this account. Many have concluded that the flood passage is of little value other than a spiritual nugget that following what God says may be a good idea. However, if patient and willing to consider some out-of-the-box ideas, the Genesis account becomes much more than a bedtime story, but a foundational event of history that validates the Bible, its New Testament authors, including Jesus, who will all refer to Noah and the flood as historical. This touches on my purpose for presenting this series. My aim is that the information covered here would give both Bible skeptics and believers pause to evaluate their assumptions about what they think they understand about the flood event. Many times believers of the Bible have a blind faith which places them in a position of having little to offer to a skeptic that would help them to see why the believer objectively trusts the Bible's account. This can lead to a heated discussion that frustrates both sides because the blind faith believer bases their argument on because God said so. This may be a true statement, but it is not going to convince someone who is skeptical of the Bible and God in the first place. For the skeptic, I think many see right away that their scientific education completely contradicts the Bible's account of origins. This becomes the basis for rejecting most of the Bible as made-up stories. Why believe in any part of a fairy tale that most agree didn't happen, right? And it follows that if the Bible's historical records are make-believe, why trust in anything it says about who God is or our moral accountability to Him? I hope this presentation can help show that the Genesis flood account actually fits modern scientific observation better than the evolution model that we've been almost exclusively and sometimes dogmatically taught. If the hydroplate theory can show that Genesis gives a very real account of the flood based on scientific principles that matches our observations, then perhaps the rejection of the Bible's historical record should be reconsidered. And if the Bible's history is in fact real, then a re-evaluation of who God is and our accountability to Him should take place as well. If correct, the hydroplate theory rewrites our scientific understanding of Earth, and therefore we'll spend most of our time focused on this first question. It is not easy to answer, and I find it requires time both to discuss and to digest. Many times questions have hidden assumptions. Notice this second question assumes that all the fountains of today, including Mount Everest, have always existed. Other questions seem to demand a miracle. 40 days and nights of Geshem rain or heavy downpour rain has never been observed. Either this did not happen, was a miracle, or we incorrectly assume that today's hydrodynamic cycle is the source and don't fully understand the real mechanism behind all this rain. The next two questions are more readily answered once the assumptions hidden in question number 2 are exposed. We too often assume that what we see today existed during Noah's day. Because most fail to identify assumptions, it becomes attractive to reinterpret the most natural reading of Genesis into something less than what it claims, thereby making it more believable to our minds. It is certainly much easier to reword a Bible passage than to rethink everything you have come to assume is correct. So does the local flood idea really fit the context? The Hebrew word for earth, eret, can mean the entire earth, land, ground, country, etc. Some try to force this passage to mean just the land or country, to support a local flood theory. However, due to the context of the passage, the local area idea must answer the following difficult questions. Were people outside the area considered righteous? Why not just move Noah, who was given 120 years warning ahead of time? This is what God did with Lot. Was God only grieved that he made man and animals in the local area? Later in chapter 9, the flood is claimed several times to have destroyed all flesh that breathed air. How does any local flood wipe out all birds? Our recorded observance of local, even very large floods does not at all match the record of events in Genesis. This event is the most chronologically detailed and precisely recorded year in the Bible. This is strange if the story is just to promote a moral lesson. In Genesis, the flood begins on the 17th day of the second month of Noah's 600th year. This must have been quite a day for it to be recorded so precisely. As we'll see, that was the last day those 8 people would see the earth as they knew it. The world they would see next was completely unrecognizable and harsh. It rains continuously for 40 straight days. Then the rain stopped, but the waters continued to rise for 110 more days and cover all pre-flood mountains. A question needs to be asked here, and that is, how could the water rise after the rain stopped? Any flood theory needs to explain the mechanism behind this. 5 months into the flood, the ark comes to rest on a high peak, after which water levels can be observed to be decreasing. 74 days later, lesser peaks become visible. 90 days after that, the waters have completely drained, but Noah, his family, and all animals do not leave the ark, apparently because conditions are still too unstable. Finally, 57 days later, and after 371 days on the ark, they are allowed to leave. This detail in the context of Genesis 7 and 8 is telling of something much bigger than anything being proposed by any of the local flood theories, which all fail to fit this detailed chronological record of dated events. The constant rain is never explained by local flood theories. The Hebrew word geshem describes heavy rain. All local floods being proposed would have distant mountains clearly visible throughout the entire episode. No local theories explain 150 days of rising waters. No local theory mechanisms support a 304-day flood period, nor do they explain why the land would have been so unstable that Noah would not have been allowed to leave the ark for 57 days after the land looked dry. Even the trendy Mesopotamian and Black Sea local flood theories fail miserably to fit the Genesis account. At some point, just to be thorough, we should ask ourselves, is it valid to change and twist a record because it is hard for us to imagine or explain its details? Sometimes it is difficult to see alternative possibilities when we have been told what to think instead of how to think critically. Let's begin to answer the 5th question. Where did the floodwaters go? Realize our oceans today cover 70% of Earth's surface, and the average basin depth is 12,000 feet. So the volume of water we have right now is plenty to cover Earth's surface. In fact, 10 times more water is on Earth's surface than there is land above sea level. In fact, if the mountains and continents of Earth were bulldozed so Earth was flat, the volume of water in today's oceans would cover the entire Earth to a depth of approximately 9,000 feet. So while huge post-flood chains like the Andes, Rockies, Alps, and Himalayas did not exist, smaller mountains up to 9,000 feet could have existed and have been easily covered during the flood. So the problem is not that we don't know where the water from the flood went, because we can see it from any beach in the world right now. Understanding this then begins to answer question 4, where did all the water come from? Answering this will take much of our time. Explaining how the water ended up in today's ocean basins will take even more time, so we will have to be patient. Why do we assume that all the water on the surface now has always been on the surface? The problem is when we assume that everything we see now has always been that way. This fallback uniformitarian assumption is ingrained in our education system, but it is not always a correct assumption. I'd encourage you to research the life work of Harlan Bretz for a small-scale example of what happens when too many assume they are right simply because popular opinion is so entrenched. When someone asks how Mount Everest could have been covered by the flood, ask them why they assume Everest and all other mountain ranges for that matter were present at the time. Hydroplate theory makes few assumptions, but if you take time to understand it, you'll see it provides excellent answers to these and dozens of other questions. This is a cross-section of Earth's present state. No one has ever dug down to see this, and you'll see why we can't dig to the center of the Earth later. However, we know this layout exists by timing seismic waves from earthquakes as they travel through the Earth. Sound travels at different speeds through solid materials than liquids, and this is the rough picture of what is down there. There is a thin crust which sits on top of an 1,800-mile thick solid mantle. Then there is a very dense molten outer core that surrounds the mostly iron-nickel inner core. The liquid of the outer core is twice the density of the rocky mantle. Zooming in on a cross-section of the surface near the edge of a continent, we would see the following. Continents are made primarily of granitic materials. The granite continents rest on the mantle. The Mohorovicic discontinuity, or MOHO, is a boundary line between the crust and the mantle. Seismic waves travel much faster below the MOHO than above, for reasons that we will soon discover. Most of the surface of all continents are covered with sedimentary rock that averages about a mile thick. Sedimentary rocks are made up of finely ground bits of crystalline rock, like granite or basalt, that have been cemented together by a cementing agent like calcium carbonate. For example, sandstone and limestone are sedimentary rocks. Metamorphic rocks occur when sedimentary or crystalline rock is greatly compressed and heated. For example, marble and diamond are metamorphic rock. The two most prominent surface rocks are basalt and granite. The floors of the ocean basins are primarily lined with basalts, which are igneous, meaning formed from a melt state. We know basalts are igneous because we see them being produced in nature and can replicate basalts from a melt in a lab. Continents are primarily granites, which are slightly less dense than basalts. Contrary to what is commonly assumed, granite does not appear to be igneous, meaning formally melted. Rather than being igneous, granite would be better termed as an enigma. Granite is made of very large crystals of quartz, feldspar, hornblende, and mica. These materials have differing densities and melting points. If granite was molten for millions of years and slowly cooled as assumed, the differing liquid mineral densities would naturally self-sort due to gravity, just like oil and water. The result would be a layered cake pattern, not the large interlocked crystalline patterns that we see today. No one has ever reproduced large-grain granites seen in nature. The end product, both in the lab and in nature, when a granite is melted and resolidified, is a plain igneous rock called rhyolite, which has tiny crystal grains like igneous basalts do. The borders and edges of continents taper and are beveled. The continents generally thin and taper out under the ocean's surface, forming the continental shelf, which runs out under the water between 300 and 600 feet deep. The true edge of the continent then rapidly drops off in a bevel shape to an ocean depth averaging 12,000 feet, forming the continental slope. Notice that the thinned continental shelf connects the continents. If ocean levels were several hundred feet lower, you could almost walk from Southeast Asia to Australia and from Siberia to Alaska. If this were the case after the flood, while much of the flood waters remained trapped on the continents, there was a good reason behind God's direction for survivors of the flood to spread out as they increased in population. This also may explain why in Genesis 9, Nimrod and those who settled on the plain of Shinar in today's Iraq were quickly confused by God with differing languages and thereby forced to spread out. This also explains why the origin of all language is tracked back to this region. About 2 generations after Babel, the earth was divided in the day of Peleg in Genesis chapter 10. Peleg's name is a root for many words today concerning water, like archipelago or bath pelagic. This lends credence to the idea that the earth was literally divided by rising ocean levels that separated the continents in the days of Peleg. I'll now give a brief general summary of how Earth formed from an evolutionary view. There are actually many differing views, but the following appears to be the most popular today. Supposedly 4.5 billion years ago, asteroids gravitationally collapsed into each other, and the energy released from these impacts produced a molten liquid Earth, which remained molten for millions of years. As accretion ceased, the surface eventually cooled and formed a solid crust, but as we just covered, a granite crust could not have originated from a previously molten condition, and no lab has ever been able to replicate granite from a molten state. The evolutionary model then states that over time, the remaining inner molten materials were gravitationally separated to form the dense solid inner and outer cores of the Earth. Note that any thermal analysis accounting for all realistic forms of heat generation and heat transfer predicts that the sphere of Earth should have completely solidified by now if it is actually 4.5 billion years old. This is one of many observations which strongly indicate the upper limit of Earth's age is much younger than assumed when relying on radiometric ratios. To further investigate the fundamental problems with radiometric dating, please refer to my other video titled Hydroplate Theory, The Origin of Earth's Radioactivity. Evolutionary theory of the Earth's origin assumes that the Earth remained in a molten state for around 200 million years. Naturally, any water brought by asteroids would rise to the surface and evaporate long before the Earth's crust solidified. A runaway greenhouse would have followed, trapping solar heat in the humid atmosphere and making life on Earth impossible forever. According to some evolutionists, millions of years after surface solidification, comets bombarded the Earth, depositing even more water on its surface. But recent discoveries of high deuterium concentration, or heavy water, on comets, compared to Earth's oceans, have led some scientists to conclude that Earth's water could not have come from comets. In summary, the evolutionary theories of how water came to be so prevalent on Earth's surface is not supported by what we observe today. But if we assume the evolutionary theory is somehow true, then basic scientific principles tell us that Earth's water should only be found on the surface. What is surprising from this evolutionary view is that there are unexpectedly large amounts of water trapped at depths far deeper than surface water could ever seep. Here is why deep water under continents is not expected. Imagine a block of soft modeling clay or Play-Doh. Now stack more blocks of clay on top. Eventually the bottom block will deform sideways due to the weight of the added blocks. Add more blocks and more of the material deforms. Now imagine that you have stacked another column of clay blocks very close to the original column. What will it do? It too will deform and compress against the other material. The dashed line represents the boundary at which the compressive strength of the clay or Play-Doh has been exceeded. Material below this boundary forms a tight seal. Even small microscopic cracks cannot exist below this boundary line. Take notice that gravity is the causal source of this condition. Even if surface water is poured into the gap or crack, it cannot seep below the boundary line. For clay or Play-Doh, this boundary may be only a few feet from the surface. You've likely seen a similar scenario after making stovetop pudding or cheesecake, after it cools in the refrigerator overnight. The semi-solid separates or cracks at the surface as it cools, but the crack is not very deep because the weight of the material slumps and closes the crack at a certain depth. Rock like granite has good compressive strength and can support a crack of up to 5 miles depth, but no deeper. In summary, assuming the evolution scenario, water from asteroids and comets collected on the surface before crust solidification, since granite's max compressive strength is approximately 23,000 pounds per square inch. No significant continental water would be expected below 5 miles depth. However, it is well known that deep water exists much deeper than this. Germany's KTB dig and Russia's Kola dig are the deepest man-made holes in Earth's crystalline continental granite. The goal of these digs was to reach the Earth's mantle rock, but neither succeeded. Both holes reached depths well below the 5-mile boundary of granite's max compressive strength. Both holes encountered unexpectedly extreme heat as depth increased. Even more surprisingly, they both struck saltwater-filled interconnected fractures in the granite. More recently, using conductivity measurements, a mile-thick layer of saltwater-filled sediments has been reported 10 miles under the Tibetan Plateau. In fact, deep saltwater appears to be a common trait under all continents. Hydroplate theory asks the question, if evolution theory does not predict deep water, then how else did the water get so deep under all the continents? At this point, it is interesting to note that the Bible indicates in several places that water was and is under the earth. Psalms repeatedly indicates this. The deep is in storehouses. The earth is founded upon the seas and upon the waters. The earth is spread out above the waters. Finally, and most telling, is the opening action of the flood recorded in Genesis 7 verse 11. The Bible strongly indicates large amounts of water were originally deep under the earth. The hydroplate theory uses these biblical descriptions in combination with many real-world observations we've just covered to derive its starting assumption about the original layout of Earth, which is radically different than what we see today, and certainly much different than what uniformitarian theory proposes. The assumed condition is that the Earth's surface crust was formed above a deep layer of water. This is a global condition wherein the Earth crust was an unbroken spherical supercontinent which covered and sealed in a deep layer of water trapped between it and the mantle rock. Many imagine that a combination of forces like the tidal pull of the moon, Coriolis forces, and centrifugal forces would somehow rip this shell apart immediately, and therefore hydroplate theory is invalid from its first assumption. However, few can maintain such a view once they compare all these forces to the dominating gravitational force of Earth. Although other forces are present, they can often be ignored because they are so small compared to gravity. There is a reason gravity is the first force we learn of in school. As we discuss the hydroplate theory's many observations, take note of how so much of the theory's explanation is simply founded upon the physics of what happens to materials under the influence of Earth's gravity. Rather than speculation about unconfirmed natural processes or imagined miracles, we'll see hydroplate theory turn again and again to Earth's gravity as the causal mechanism which drove processes and produced various effects. The Bible records further detail of these assumed starting conditions in the creation account of Genesis 1. The Hebrew for waters here is mayim, which is always used to describe liquid water. Many attempt to explain waters in verse 2 as if it is a frozen or gaseous vapor in space, but Hebrew does not use mayim to describe those states of water. Hebrew has many other words to describe ice, clouds, and vapor states, so clearly liquid water is in view. Then on the second day of creation, God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." The word rakia comes from the root word raka, meaning to spread, beat, or hammer out as with a metal. It can also mean a plate. The Septuagint translates rakia with stereoma, meaning a solid, firm structure. The Latin Vulgate uses the term firmamentum, from which the King James translators coined the term firmament. The implication is that the expanse was a solid, firm material. Again, mayim is used in verse 6, so day 2 seems to describe a state where liquid waters from Genesis 1 verse 2 were divided in half and separated by a solid plate of material. Remember I said granite is an enigma and has never been replicated. Hydroplate theory proposes that this expanse material was a miraculous formation of a granite crust separating surface water from the waters of the deep. On the third day, Genesis 1 describes the results of God's further direction to firmly position the somewhat unstable expanse and bring it to a more stable equilibrium. Hydroplate theory proposes that the granite expanse was deformed at many points around the Earth, which settled into the solid mantle foundation below. Naturally, the thicker and denser portions of the crust would sink to the solid mantle foundation, but because the volume of water trapped below the crust was fixed, the lighter and less dense portions of the crust had to rise out of the water. This is exactly what Genesis 1 verse 9 describes when God says, "Let the dry land appear." The deformations raised the topography at the surface for dry land, and the depressions gathered surface waters, producing small seas. Again, Psalm seems to add further description that matches with this concept. Psalm 75:3, "It is I who have firmly set its pillars." Remember Psalm 33:7 said that God laid up the deep in storehouses. It is important to note that the pillars themselves did not support the entire weight of the crust. Most of the weight was supported by the pressurized water of the deep. With much of the water trapped under the crust, Earth would have had much more available land mass with many small shallow seas dotting the surface. Mountains would have been smaller than today. Hydroplate theory figures that approximately half of the water in today's ocean started out under the granite shelf, forming one giant supercontinent all around the globe. This estimate of the volume of water under the crust is based on the concentration of salt in the oceans today compared to what was found in the Bavarian KTP dig hole. In addition, water found in comets contains around twice the deuterium concentration that is in the oceans. The estimate also assumes that pre-flood seas were fresh water, which after the flood mixed about equal parts with this super salty deuterium-rich subterranean water, diluting it to the levels measured in the oceans today. I will describe more about the most likely origin of comets later, so hold on to this info, as I'm sure at this point it seems strange that water and comets would have anything to do with the flood or with the Earth. Hydroplate does not place an upper bound on the original volume of water in the chamber because there are some unknowns that have a large effect on the final answer. Today we know there are large amounts of water trapped deep in the porous Mohorovičić boundary layers, but we don't know by volume how much is down there. We also don't know how much water escaped Earth's atmosphere during the flood. Both of these unknown variables would add to the volume estimate based on the above concentrations of deuterium and salt. So for now, we'll just say the deep, or the Great Deep as referred to in Genesis 7:11, was a global interconnected subcrustal ocean chamber that was at least 0.9 miles deep at the time of the flood. Based on observations of current size and thickness of continents, hydroplate theory proposes that the original granite plate was 60 miles thick. If you've read prior editions of the theory, you'll notice that this has increased from initial estimates of 10 miles thickness. This change was arrived at after carefully considering the implications of several rather recent discoveries. Most recently in New Zealand, researchers have used explosives to generate specific short wavelength seismic waves to produce the clearest picture of what they believe to be a subducting plate. They are puzzled, however, because almost 50 miles down, a 6-mile thick channel containing melted rock and/or water has also been identified. This is not at all what popular plate tectonic theory predicts. For hydroplate theory, these discoveries are exciting because they are consistent with how a collapsed water-permeated subterranean chamber would be expected to reflect these seismic waves. The much slower wave velocities measured in the channel indicate magma and/or water trapped within the chamber's roof and floor. We will soon cover in detail how hydroplate theory explains these findings using cause-to-effect reasoning. This is the first strong evidence that the granite crust was in fact much thicker than previous estimates. Corroborating this is the growing body of evidence that trans-Neptunian objects, or TNOs, are most likely from Earth as well. We'll discuss this further later on. For now, we'll continue discussing the assumed initial pre-flood conditions. Remember, no cracks can exist in granite below 5 miles. So the perfect seal conditions we just reviewed existed to keep the surface waters from seeping down and, more importantly, the subsurface waters of the deep from pushing up through the granite. These are the basic starting assumptions of the hydroplate theory. From here, the theory uses only laws of physics to explain cause to effect, which we'll see provides reasonable and straightforward explanation of Earth's surface features today. This is a phase diagram for water. At atmospheric conditions, we see water freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 14.7 pounds per square inch pressure. As heat is added, ice melts and the temperature rises until at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, boiling produces vapor. The weight of 60 miles of granite above means that the Great Deep was pressurized to approximately 372,000 pounds per square inch. As will be seen, work was being done on the water of the Great Deep, which gradually increased its internal energy, so we will refer back to this diagram several times and see how conditions in the water changed and the dramatic effects that were produced. Just as the moon's gravity works to produce the ocean tides, the original granite shell would also have been worked and distorted by the moon's gravity. However, because it was a solid shell of great mass, the tidal effect on the crust was not as dramatic as with the open sea. Still, the crust would have deformed into a slight egg shape toward the moon. Obviously, the graphic has been exaggerated so we can see the distortions, and I've simplified the pillars to only 4 dark brown shapes, where the granite was pressed into the solid mantle. In reality, the global surface area of the relatively thin 60-mile crust would have allowed it to form pillars at thousands of locations. Twice a day the shell would have deformed, so the trapped waters of the deep were continually being pumped through the subterranean chamber at high pressure. This work added energy in the form of heat to the waters under the crust. At the same time, each pillar experienced tension, compression, and shear loads twice a day. Friction from these cyclic loads slowly heated the pillars as well. To get an idea of how these forces produced heat, bend a steel wire or a paper clip back and forth several times, then touch it at the bend. Now imagine how much heat would be generated at the extreme pressures in rock 60 miles deep. As tidal pumping continued, the pressure and temperature in the subterranean chamber increased. Eventually, liquid water changed phase into a state known as supercritical water. The hydroplate theory is not the first to recognize the possibility of a supercontinent. We all learned about Edward Bullard's Pangea concept in high school. Few of us were encouraged to look at it critically, however. For example, what happened to half of Mexico and Central America? And what forces rotated North America clockwise, while South America was rotated counterclockwise? We also probably did not catch the fact that Africa's area is actually 35% larger than we were shown in the books. That's right, Africa had to be scaled down by about 35% to make it fit the picture. In fact, Africa and Europe fit poorly with the Americas when positioned in 3D on a globe, especially when you include the continental shelves that extend under the oceans and do not allow removal of materials as needed in order to force a fit. There is another feature on the globe that fits these coastlines much better. One of the key observations Walt Brown has made is that with an actual 3D globe, the coastlines of all four continents fit very well with the mid-oceanic ridge. Discovered in the 1950s, the ridge, which wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball, is the longest mountain chain at 46,000 miles length. The fact that this is almost entirely covered by water is not the only trait that sets it apart from today's continental surface mountains. As we'll soon see, the mid-oceanic ridge is a scar in Earth's mantle left over from the flood, which roughly traces the path of the crack that opened up in the granite shell. Surface mountains appear to be the result of compressed materials that have been piled up. This makes sense. Push compressed material together and it piles up. But the mountains of the mid-oceanic ridge are uniquely different than surface mountains. Tensile fractures show that the material has been pulled apart in two perpendicular directions. This is counterintuitive. How do you build a mountain chain by pulling material apart, in two directions no less? Hydroplate theory explains the unique conditions that produced this strange global geologic feature. We will discuss how this happened later, but first let's continue to investigate the nature of supercritical fluids, since it is key to understanding and grasping the magnitude and direction of energy released during the flood.